to the City of Sacramento's weekly Wednesday webinar. My name is Darren Gale, and I'm with the City of Sacramento's Office of Innovation and Economic Development. We appreciate your attendance today and hope that you'll appreciate the information we're sharing with you. Our webinar series is Resilience, Repurpose, and Recovery, and today we have really a great presentation about PPP forgiveness, COVID outbreaks, and tax credits. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be on the city's website at www.cityofsacramento.org/bizwebinars, and that'll be on our website by tomorrow. And then also, if you would like to see the slides, we'll also make sure and have a copy of those slides for you. At this time, I'd like to introduce and turn over the time to a local Sacramento business, BizHaven. And from that point, they'll take it from here, and they'll introduce our speakers and our panelists today. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the chat feature, and we'll do our best to get to every single question. So I'll turn it over now to BizHaven. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and to Darren and the City of Sacramento for welcoming us to participate in today's webinar focusing on PPP forgiveness, COVID outbreaks, protected leaves, and FFCRA tax credits. My name is Alex. I'm one of the founders here at BizHaven. Before we jump into things, just a little quick blurb on BizHaven. We're an HR and safety resource for employers based here in Sacramento. We specialize in working with small to medium-sized businesses, focusing our efforts in simplifying HR and safety compliance while simultaneously lowering your company's liability and overhead in California and across the nation as well. Our goal with doing these webinars is really to make it easier for you to get direct feedback and answer your questions while streamlining what you're finding on the internet or in the news, and give direct access to professionals who know what they're talking about. That said, I'd like to introduce you to Anna. Anna Town is one of our co-founders here at BizHaven. She's worked with over 200 businesses in the SAC region, bettering internal processes, lowering exposure, and strengthening teams and overall culture. We'll also have Steve Roth speaking, who owns his own consulting firm, Roth Consulting. Steve is associated with the Northern California Small Business Development Center, also known as the SBDC. There, Steve is working with entrepreneurs and small business owners across a very broad range of businesses, focusing on growth strategies, business plans, and finance programs. And most recently, a lot of Steve's focus has been the pandemic, and also has worked with 200 clients securing PPP and EIDL loans. We're lucky to have Anna and Steve speaking today. So thanks, you guys. We appreciate it for being here and sharing your knowledge with everybody. With that said, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you, Anna, to get started.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, City of Sacramento, as well as Darren, for having us on board today. We're excited to be presenting this topic today, and we're going to provide some great information, especially on the PPP forgiveness, with Steve here on board with us. And he's going to be providing some great information, as I said, but also it's important for you guys to know is lots of questions surrounding this topic. So we do encourage, as these questions come up as we're going through this presentation today, to chat those in, because we want to make sure those questions are answered. As Steve will talk about a little bit later, there's still some answers that we don't have exactly, but he's very knowledgeable and would be able to provide some of that info. So what are we speaking directly about today? As Alex said, we'll first highlight the outbreaks in the workplace with COVID-19, lots of that going on, especially since the shelter in place was lifted a little bit ago. And we have seen, especially on our client side of things, we have seen more outbreaks come up in the workplace. So we'll talk specifically about that. What are those protected leaves for employees as these outbreaks come up? And then we'll get into the bulk of the training or the seminar, which is that PPP forgiveness. I'll be going through different questions that we most commonly hear from our clients on when it comes to PPP, and Steve will do a really good job at answering those questions. But again, encouraging you to chat those questions in if we don't mention it while we're going through this. And then a quick wrap up at the end regarding the tax credit for those protected leaves that employees are using. So jumping right into it is this, these outbreaks in the workplace. And all of you that are part of this seminar today have more or less probably experienced this, and whether it be maybe one of your employees was potentially exposed, or there's maybe a positive outbreak inside your workplace. And as we all know, this is probably more common than not. This is, spreading quite rapidly, and more people out there getting tested to see if they've, are positive for COVID-19. So not a surprise any longer. This is has been going on for months now, but from an employer standpoint, we really need to decipher, these outbreaks that we are having inside the workplace, are they really high risk, medium risk, or low risk? So I really want to identify that today. So with the high risk category, this would be if there was an actual confirmed COVID-19 case, an employee has tested positive for COVID-19, or they've presumed to test positive, meaning there's a presence of COVID-19 related symptoms, and those can be anything from, you name it. I think we're all hearing a wide variety of symptoms at this point, but the standard ones, the cough, fever, shortness of breath. Most recent, I think a lot are coming forward with headaches, even just like flu-like symptoms, not even necessarily having a fever. I mean, you name it, loss of taste or smell, etc. Lots of different symptoms out there. Our team was actually just talking about how are employers going to decipher, as we are amidst or coming upon this cold and flu season, how are employers going to decipher between COVID-19 versus just the normal flu out there? And difficult to say, right? Because the COVID-related symptoms are so vast, and so many are experiencing different symptoms. So I would say more to come on that. So that's the high risk category. Now we've had someone that's presumed positive at this point. Then there's the medium risk. So employee had contact with someone with a confirmed COVID case, whether it's the shelter in place has been lifted and now they're at a family barbecue or a friend barbecue, and they've been in close contact, that 6 feet proximity, where someone has now after the fact tested positive, and they've had that interaction, more than 15 minutes with this person, and they're now concerned that they may potentially have contracted this virus if they've had this close contact. Has the employee, one thing we always want to keep in mind, did this employee use good hygiene during that time? Were they following the necessary protocol, et cetera? So these are things, when we think about the risk category, maybe, if it was hugging, for example, or getting in that close contact less than 6 feet on multiple occasions while interacting with this individual, have they been doing the best, designated protocol there? So that could move them into more of the high risk category. And then we have the low risk. So employee had, and this is where I think a lot of people stand and a lot of our employees stand. So employee had no physical contact and no prolonged interaction within less than 6 feet with an employee with COVID-like symptoms, or the employee had contact that is 2 or more instances removed. So someone who was in contact with someone who was in contact with someone. We're hearing a lot of that right now. I just heard something from a friend earlier today. We were in contact with this person who was in contact with this one who has tested positive. So chances are, we all know, maybe it's not a close family friend or relative at this point, but we all know of someone who may have contracted the virus from someone. So it's out there. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, but point being, we really need to interject as an employer and identify that risk category, because there are definite responsibilities from an employer standpoint when it comes to these outbreaks in the workplace. So some questions to ask the employee so we can identify those risks. If those symptoms began, when did they begin? Can you determine where and when you have or were exposed to COVID-19? During the last 14 days prior to your symptoms, where did you go within that workplace? Who did you have the direct interaction with? What customers did you see? What workplace of customers did you go to? Have you been doing that self-isolating? back. Sorry about that. Have you been practicing frequent hand hygiene while in the customer's workplaces? Have you been doing the social distancing? You know, at this point, we should all have a good understanding of the necessary protocol we should all be taking inside our workplaces at this point. And one of those is practicing that 6-foot social distancing. Who have you spent prolonged time with? Where specifically has it been? When has it been? Etc. So getting to know these details before we determine what is the potential exposure inside the workplace.
So we had a question about this, if you don't mind me interrupting, if that's okay. So as it relates to the employee, what are they required to tell you or not required? So if a business does ask these questions and the employee is unwilling to answer those questions, how should the employer respond?
So and great question. It's kind of the segue into this next slide. So what are our responsibilities depending on risk? We all have responsibilities, whether you are the manager, the owner of the company, or whether you're the employee. So specifically for employees, we need to train our employees that they have to immediately notify management, whether they've been exposed or if they themselves have symptoms, their family member at home has tested positive, whatever those indications are, it's their responsibility that they have to notify management. And then they should be immediately self-quarantining because as we've all known and heard, this is spreading like wildfire. So we want to make sure as soon as someone makes it aware that they've been, you know, exposed in this regard, they would want to immediately self-quarantine. And then the management responsibilities right below that, we want to make sure we notify close contact employees and customers, and that's anyone that we've had, you know, that interaction with less than 6 feet, more than 15 minutes. You know, someone sits next to me that has contracted the virus. We're letting these individuals know, as well as we're letting our entire staff know. Now, from a HIPAA concern, we're not saying, okay, Steve Roth over here, he has the virus. We're saying someone has tested positive inside our facility, and these are the measures that we're taking as a business, proper protocol as far as cleaning, et cetera, and then encouraging again that, you know, requirements of those employees that they need to come forward if they have any symptoms, if they've been exposed, et cetera. And then we make sure we're coordinating that deep clean for the facility. HR's responsibilities, so whether that be a direct HR person as well as, you know, someone that handles the HR functions inside the organization, obviously confirming and recording that COVID-19 case and documenting those self-quarantine employees, making sure, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, but the leaves, if there's any necessary leaves that come into play, that we're complying with that, and then making sure before that employee returns to work that we've, you know, gone through the necessary time frame so if they were in fact the ones that had the virus, that they're not coming back and putting others at risk at that point. Okay. So discontinuation of isolations for persons with COVID-19, and this is specifically not for those in healthcare settings. So I would imagine it's probably, those, most of you on this seminar today. So basically what CDC has stated, and this actually came out the end of July, I think it was July 24th, CDC came out with new timeframes for employers to really look at when there is a positive case inside the workplace. So in general, people with COVID who have symptoms may return to work under the following conditions. And that's at least 10 days have passed since the onset of symptoms. At least 24 hours have passed since resolution of fever without the use of any fever-reducing medications. So that at least maybe they started with a sore throat, for example, and that started 10 days ago. But we also want to look at the last 24 hours and have they not been using any fever-reducing medications at that time. And obviously other symptoms have improved. Some more serious symptoms can take longer, so up to 20 days someone may need to be off work. And then we hear a lot about those people who have tested positive with no symptoms. And the same goes for them, that we'd want to, make sure that they didn't return to work until 10 days after their test, assuming they don't have any or don't develop any symptoms in the meantime. So per the current EEOC guidance, employers may require sick employees to obtain a return to work release from a healthcare provider. However, CDC's recommendations are basically encouraging employers to not require a positive, or a negative test result, so not requiring that negative test result to return to work. So if we're following these, number one guidelines, if they've tested positive, has there been at least 10 days, they're not using any medication within the last 24 hours when they return to work, or those without symptoms, has it been that 10 days as well? And then the protected leaves, I'm sure we've all heard lots about this, but there are the protected leaves out there when these situations arise. And there's the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, as well as the Emergency FMLA. And this, it allows, from effective the April 1st through the end of the year, allows employees to dip into this emergency paid sick leave if they themselves have contracted the virus, or they have been exposed to the virus and are required to self-quarantine at that time. And this is for those employers with less than 500 employees, and it's specifically to that Families First Coronavirus Response Act that was developed. And I'll talk more about the tax credits later on. Here is the posting that is now required to be posted inside each organization regarding this FSCRA. As long as you have less than 500 employees, this should be posted through the end of the year, as well as given to new employees as we bring them on board inside the organization. Again, here's the what's allowed with employees. So the 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave, if they've contracted or been exposed, required to self-quarantine, etc. 6 different reasons, either full pay or 2/3 pay, depending on the reason. And employees, just some quick tips on this, are eligible first day of employment. There's no introductory period. Full-time would be 80 hours. Part-time would be an average hours over a 2-week period. And then there's those reimbursement rates. So 100% and then 2/3 pay for the rest. And I'll show you that in a minute. And then we have what's emergency paid FMLA, and this would be up to 12 weeks. So take out that first 80 hours of the emergency paid sick leave. So for days 11 through 60, this would be caring for their child if the child's school or place of care has been closed, or the child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19 precautions. A lot of this has gone out the window because some child care facilities have been able to open up since the shelter in place has been lifted, or employees have figured out, different ways of having care for their children. Maybe they're working from home, or different options out there. So we're not hearing as many questions in regards to this emergency FMLA, but more on the emergency paid sick leave questions. Here is an example of the request form for emergency paid sick leave and emergency FMLA. You'll see those check boxes. So an employee is actually attesting to, acknowledging that they themselves have been either contracted the virus, they're under, doctor's care, for example, their healthcare advisor is advising that they do self-quarantine at this time. They're caring for another individual who has either tested positive or has to self-quarantine, or they need to take the FMLA, as I just mentioned, to care for their children. So this is something that, as an employer, and this will go along with those tax credits that we'll talk about later on, that an employer should be documenting these requests, as well as making sure that your employees are attesting to, and you'll see that down at the bottom of this form, it does indicate that the employee is authorizing or basically certifying that the information that they've provided is correct. And the importance of that is right now, we've heard lately, actually, it's all over the board. You know, those that are testing positive, some are not testing positive, but getting tested for COVID-19. Some are getting results within a day, but that's very unlikely. Most of the time, it's usually 5 to 7 days. That's what we're hearing from our clients. So one of the most recent that we've heard is two people that we know or from clients specifically, had made an appointment with Kaiser, and they were able to get the results back within 24 hours. So I don't know if that's the case for every Kaiser facility, or if an appointment is made, if that's what happens or what comes up with that. But in most cases, what we've heard, it does take that 5 to 7 days and sometimes even longer to get those results. So we're presuming as an employer that, you know, if our employees have either had that, you know, potential exposure, their family member is sick at home, or they have now started these symptoms, that we're going to presume that they have tested positive at this point. So that's why we're having our employees certifying and acknowledging to this. So lots about FFCRA and COVID, but I think what most people want to hear about today is not about that, because this has been going on for a while, but mostly about this PPP forgiveness and what's next. So as I said, I'm going to be asking Steve some questions, but we want to encourage, if we're not answering those questions that you have on your end, make sure to chat those in. I'll stop for a second and ask if there's any questions that came in for the first part of this presentation.
There were no questions on my end.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Steve, I'm going to ask you this lovely question all about PPP forgiveness and what's next. So I think it's a good time to give a quick overview of what PPP is and how employers have basically utilized that PPP.
So as most of you know, I'm sure, PPP stands for Payroll Protection Program, and it was passed by Congress back in April in order to provide money, essentially free money, to businesses for maintaining employment. So the nature of the triple P process was you computed your average monthly payroll for 2019, you multiplied that by 2.5, you applied through your local lender bank to the program, and then sometime in the next 4 to 5 weeks, you were funded. The PPP program has a couple of unique aspects to it. Primarily, it was a non-recourse loan, meaning nobody personally guaranteed a PPP loan, no matter how large it was. And second, that it's one of the very few programs in the history of the SBA that was designed to be forgivable. So for most of the people, most of the PPP loans will be forgiven, and they have no tax effect. Now, unlike many forgiveness of loan issues where the forgiveness becomes income, here the forgiveness has no tax effect at all. And when it was started, it was designed to be short-term because the feeling back in March was that the coronavirus would go away quickly, and therefore the program would operate to maintain employment over an intense 8-week period. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. COVID hasn't gone away, as the first part of the program so aptly shows. And so in June, the government changed the program to go from an 8-week use period to a 24-week use period. And that was because for some businesses, the 8 weeks worked out just fine. They maintained employment, they made it through a difficult period, and they came out the other end. For other businesses like restaurants, bars, any business which required physically touching another person, hairdressing, facials, it was difficult to open and stay open. And so it was for those businesses that the longer use period was changed. So now if you were funded after June 5th, you have 24 weeks to use the money. And then you have another 10 months after the end of your use period to apply for forgiveness. If you were funded before June 5th, you were in the 8-week use period and then you could apply for forgiveness. But if you were in the early period, you can always ask your lender to switch you from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. So you have more time to use the funds. But the 8 weeks were 8 weeks exactly. Day one was the day you got funded, and it went for 56 consecutive days. And so the program has gotten more flexible. There's some talk about another round of PPP, but I think as everybody knows, talks in Washington have not gone well. So there's no way to tell if and when another round of payroll protection program might roll through.
So Steve, a follow-up question on that as related to requesting the lender to change from the 8 weeks to 24 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Does that request need to occur prior to the end of their 8 weeks?
No, anytime you want.
Okay.
So, do it now. If you feel that for most companies, the shorter period is just fine because you were given 2.5 months of payroll. And at the beginning, 75% of the funds were to be used for people expenses and 25% were to be used for a combination of rent, interest on your mortgage if you work from home or own the space, utilities, some transportation expenses that were never well defined, and any interest on business loans incurred before February 15th, 2020. You couldn't pay the principal, but you could pay the interest. So the use of funds for PPP were designed mostly to go to employees, but also keep the doors open, pay rent, turn the lights on, collect the garbage, et cetera, so people could go to work. If you couldn't use the funds over that period of time, you deal with your lender directly. They're your intermediary. Just send them an email whenever they send you a note about forgiveness, and you're automatically entitled to the change of period. So it's not discretionary. If you want the 24 weeks, ask for it and you'll have it. It kind of doesn't make any difference, but it can influence people when it comes to forgiveness, which I think we'll get to in a minute. So, did you want to flip or?
Perfect. Yep. So this is a big question we've been having from our clients. How should they be tracking this PPP spending? So that's that number one question on there.
Sure. Well, most of the tracking will come in the form of your payroll report. Because if you're a corporation, you have to file a federal 940 and 941 form. And those are the forms, they come straight from your payroll company based upon the information you gave them. And that's your proof that you spent money on payroll. Now, again, in the beginning, it was 75% for payroll expenses. And that includes direct payments to employees, salary, bonuses, travel, stipends, hazard pay, coronavirus pay for coming in, as well as direct benefits paid by the company for the employee, not paid by the employee for the employee herself. So, but then they lowered that to 60%. So if you received, so I can do the arithmetic easily, if you received $10,000 of PPP money, 6,000 of that had to go for payroll expenses. The other 4,000 could be split between rent, utilities, interest on debts incurred before February 15th, 2020, and transportation costs if they're an integral part of your company. So if you were running a bus service company, then you could pay for the cost of gas for the buses and things. And then for non-payroll expenses, which is the vast bulk of it, you would just keep track of it by memo form. You have QuickBooks or whatever your accounting system is. If you're a sole proprietor and you don't have a payroll, you would just keep track of it in memo form. But if you're a sole proprietor or an individual contractor, or you have below a certain number of employees, you're only going to have to fill out a form that the government has referred to as 3508 EZ. EZ's for easy. It's a 1.5-page form, very simple. If you're a larger corporation, your 940 and 941 payroll report will encapsulate 60% or more of your total spending. And the 60% is the base. So if you spent 100% of it on payroll, that's just fine.
Okay,
And,
perfect.
yeah. And now forgiveness is going to start sometime soon.
But before you move on,
Sure.
we had a question from one of our participants, and they said,
Okay, Gavin.
is there a difference for an employee versus a shareholder? And sometimes that shareholder could be an employee.
An employee is defined as someone who's paid by the company through the company.
And shareholders can be paid by the
And
company, correct?
And I'm on the payroll, then I'm on the payroll, right? I can own the company and work for the company, but if I own the company and I don't work for the company and I get a distribution or a dividend at the end of the year, then I'm not part of the PPP forgiveness, but I also wasn't part of the PPP funding because I don't run through payroll. So for anyone who applied for PPP, if you're a corporation and you have a formal payroll, which everyone has to have, then you submitted your 940 and 941 forms from 2019 to prove what you spent. If you were a sole proprietor, you submitted a Schedule C to show the profit or loss on your business, right? So for the vast majority of people doing forgiveness, they'll use the 3508 easy form. They'll have to provide some basic information, but you won't be sending in receipts for rent or your utility bill paid. You just want to keep that in some kind of memo form off your accounting system, or if you're a sole proprietor running your own consulting firm or whatever your business might be, you would keep it on an Excel spreadsheet and be able to track it back to a check or some other payment. And so forgiveness will start soon. They're finalizing the forms now. You'll be notified through your lender, whoever you got your PPP loan through. They're going to be your primary contact, and they'll send you an email. And the email will tell you that forgiveness has started. And they'll also make the forms you need available to you, so you don't have to hunt for them. They'll be available on their website, or you can download them from the bank or finance company, whoever your lender was for the process. And so it'll go pretty easily. You have no pressure to do this quickly because you don't have to file your forgiveness until 10 months after your use of funds period. So if I was funded on May 1st for my PPP and I elect to do a 24-week use period, that's 6 months. So I don't have to begin filing until November the 1st or December the 1st. I can't do math anymore. November the 1st. And you have 10 months later. So basically you have 16 months from the time you were funded in order to file your forgiveness form. And for some people, it would make sense to wait until the very end, because if you do file at the end of the 10-month period after your use of funds, and you do owe any money, you won't have to pay any money until the forgiveness is adjudicated between the bank and the SBA. So you'll probably buy yourself another 6 to 8 weeks of not having loan payments to make. For most people, it won't be a problem. Most people will have, close to 100% forgiveness. That's the way it was designed to work. The other thing is that when the program started in April 3rd, you had to sign or check a box that said you had no other access to capital and you couldn't get any money anywhere else. And you also had to allow yourself to be audited. Those two provisions went away on June 5th. So part of the revised PPP law for June 5th that extended the use period to 24 weeks basically said if you borrowed less than $2 million, it's assumed you had no other access to capital. You don't have to prove it. And no one who borrowed less than $2 million is subject to audit, unless you do something very foolish and very wrong, in which case you can always be audited, but there won't be any audits. 30 million people, 30 million businesses got money, so they can't audit everybody. So you've got a long period of time to file for forgiveness. Your first payment isn't due until 10 months after your use period ends. So if you take an 8-week use period, it's literally a year before the first payment is due. If you have a 6-month use period, it's 16 months before the first payment is due. It's a very long time. Also, if you do owe any money and you were funded before June 5th, you can ask your lender to put you on the 5-year term loan plan. The original PPP rules specified a 2-year term loan for anything that you owed, but now everyone is entitled to a 5-year term loan, which reduces the monthly payments. The interest rate is the same, 1%. So if you do have a residual that you owe, you'll only be paying you'll have a 1% loan payable over 5 years, which for most people will be a few pennies a month. The one thing you do need to be careful of is that these loans are non-recourse loans. And as long as you spend the funds in that 60-40 split between people costs and non-people costs, and you don't do anything with the money that you're not supposed to do, like go to Vegas or pay off your home loan or whatever you might do, the loan remains a non-recourse loan, meaning it's not personally guaranteed for the life of the loan. So if the worst scenario happened and coronavirus continues for a very long period of time and you're forced to close the business, when you do, your PPP loan is not personally guaranteed by you. So following the rules has 2 big benefits. 1, it remains a non-personally guaranteed note. And 2, you get the full forgiveness at the other end. Good?
Yeah, we had a follow-up question, Steve. It just said, and maybe you can just elaborate a little bit further, if I cannot return to pre-COVID employment level, but still spend 60+% on PPP funds on payroll, is my forgiveness docked?
It should be, yeah. I mean, you can, someone can always email me with very specific questions, in terms of the company, but as long as you, well, remember, forgiveness itself is not a function of the dollars, right? So the dollars, what you spend the money on, sets you up to be forgiven and maintains the loan as a non-recourse loan. Forgiveness is a simple function of how many employees, how many full-time equivalent employees you had as per the federal standard from either the beginning of 2020 or a similar period back in 2019 versus how many employees you have at the end of your use of funds period. So just to make life simple, you're a sole proprietor. You had 1 employee before COVID started, and assuming you don't fire yourself, you'll have 1 employee after COVID. So your forgiveness is basically 1 divided by 1 equals 100%. So you have 100% forgiveness. If you had 10 employees before COVID and did everything right, so you're eligible for forgiveness, but you only have 8 employees at the end of your use period, then you would be entitled to 8 divided by 10, which is 80%. You'd have 80% of the loan forgiven. So the key thing to look at is forgiveness is driven by labor hours, and they'll come off your labor report, your 940, and it's limited to the federal standard of 40 hours per week is a full-time equivalent. And forgiveness doesn't matter that I have 10 employees and some are part-time and some are full-time. It's simply a function of your total full-time equivalent employees before and after COVID, with the objective of having the same number of people. If you have more, that's great, but you don't get more money back. If you have less, do it. The one exception is, I'll just pick on Anna. Anna's was an employee of mine. I had to lay her off. I asked Anna to come back, and she said no. She refused to return. If I send Anna a registered letter offering her job back with whatever the salary and hours are that would make it an equivalent, and Anna doesn't respond to me, doesn't return, she doesn't have to say no, then I get to drop Anna out of my denominator. So if Anna was, I'll make her a full-time employee, she was 40 hours a week. Before COVID started, I had 10 employees, of which Anna was one. Now I have 9 employees from the standpoint of forgiveness. My denominator goes down. So I'm better. So if I have multiple employees who refuse to return, you just have to document that by sending them a letter asking them to come back. They don't come back, you take them out of the denominator. So it's designed, the system is designed to help people actually get full forgiveness. But it's labor hours for forgiveness and labor and dollars for use of funds.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. There was some appreciation on the other end for giving such great information. So thank you on that. So it looks like you answered those 2 questions. There was a question that I had on the previous, with the application process that has not started yet, how hefty is that process going to be? As we know, those that applied for this loan, it wasn't an easy process. Do you anticipate the forgiveness aspect to be a little bit easier on the employer end this time, or?
I do. Yes. I think it's going to be very straightforward. The forms are, okay. I've seen all the forms in their current stages, and it's really going to be very simple, especially if you can qualify for the 3508 easy form. It's essentially a page and a half. So okay. I think it'll be pretty straightforward. If not, you can always get help filling out the forms or talking through the issues by contacting the NorCal SBDC network. They have people there that can help you and help you fill out the forms and help you work with your lender. But the lenders will be there to help you through the process too.
Okay, perfect.
And if the PP,
and then the next question, go ahead. Yeah, if it's not forgiven, what are next steps? And I think every employer out there that has this PPP loan at this point is a little bit nervous about that. What happens if my loan isn't forgiven? What are next steps from there?
Well, again, the most important thing is spend the money in accordance with the rules, and it remains a not personally guaranteed note, which is a good thing. The worst thing, you want the loan to be not personally guaranteed. But let's just say I got a PPP loan of $10,000, and I had 10 employees, and now I have 9, and so I owe $1,000. So I would have a $1,000 5-year loan at 1%. And my first payment would be in 16 months after I was funded. And you just pay it back in the normal course. If the business does, if the business does close, then it becomes an unsecured note, an unsecured accounts payable from you to the SBA, and you just deal with your lender about it. But most of the people should have most of their PPP loans forgiven, especially if you take the 24-week use period. You have a long time to accumulate expenses on 24 weeks.
Okay.
And as we said, the risk of the SBA auditing you is probably good if you were given over $2 million, and virtually non-existent if you got under $2 million. So if there's anyone who got more than 2 million, you should email me, because I want to know you and be your friend.
Expect some big things, right? Okay. I think those were the wrap-up of questions with PPP, unless Darren and Alex, if you see any additional questions that have come in.
There weren't any additional questions on my end.
None on my end either.
Okay, Steve, so I'll just ask you one more question on your front. What questions that we didn't address today are you hearing from some of the small businesses that you're working with?
Oh, well, I mean, most of the questions now really relate to the definition of payroll, right? So if you're having a hard time coming up with expenses, then, payroll costs can include all of the things you normally do for employees that the company pays for. Also, people have gotten concerned about, they were funded inside a payroll period. So you were funded on the 1st of May, but your payroll period started on the 28th of April. And do I have to prorate my payroll periods? And you don't. The rules allow you to select a primary period for expenses like rent and utilities, and then a secondary period for payroll. So you can start your payroll count on the first day of the next payroll period after you were funded. So if I was funded on May 1st, but that's in the middle of a payroll period, and my next payroll period begins on May the 7th, then I would just start my payroll count from May 7th and go out either 56 days or 24 weeks. And that makes life a lot simpler because you can take whole payroll runs. You're also allowed to pay people bonuses. The one thing that people should be aware of is that if Steve works 50 hours a week, then I'm technically a 1 1/4 employee, right? 50 hours worked, 40 hours is the standard for a full-time equivalent person. However, for Triple P, the goal was to create as many jobs as possible using the funds provided. And therefore, the feds cap it at 40 hours. So giving people overtime and having a fewer people work 45 hours, 50 hours, or 60 hours will not help you towards your forgiveness. It'll help use the money, but it won't help you towards forgiveness. So if you have a situation where it's hard to use the funds, just take the longer 24-week period, and that gives you many extra payroll cycles. You may use it all up in 16 weeks. You don't need the 24, but you go to the end of the 24-week period. The same is true with sole proprietors. The maximum amount of income you can allocate to this program is $100,000 a year. So if you got the maximum amount of money for a sole proprietor of $20,833, and you can allocate out $1,900 a week, you'd pick the 24-week period, and at the end of 11 weeks, you've used up 100% of the PPP loan on payroll. You don't have to worry about rent and utilities and old debts. So it's very simple to do. And
Steve,
again, I'm happy to help anyone.
I hate to interrupt, but we had another question come in if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
The question was, if you were closed and your next payroll is many weeks later, does the clock start then? Or is it the first calendar-based payroll cycle after funding?
First calendar-based payroll cycle after funding.
Okay, great. Pretty straightforward.
Yes, pretty straightforward. But then it goes for whatever the period is straight through, right? It won't stop and start, right? So if you were open and closed during, for a period, you're better off taking the 24 weeks, and you'll have been open enough, hopefully, over the 6 months to use up all the funds. But once you start with that next payroll period, you're going to run straight through. So if you're open, you can use the 8-week period. If you were open and closed, or you didn't have as many people in, use a 24-week period, and that'll help you.
Great. Thank you.
Perfect. You've added some great knowledge around PPP. Just have a couple more slides to wrap up, and then we're going to show Steve's information at the end in case there are some, pressing questions or you need some further help from him as well. But thank you, Steve, for your knowledge.
You're welcome.
On the topic.
I'll sign off.
So I would stay on for a minute just in case if there's any additional questions that come in. So just to wrap this up, there are the employer tax credits when it comes to that emergency paid sick leave, as well as that emergency FMLA. Just some quick reminders here. So eligible employers are entitled to receive those tax credits. So as your employees are testing positive or having to self-quarantine, cannot be at work, and they can't do teleworking at that time and have to tap into this emergency paid sick leave or emergency FMLA, there are the tax credits that are associated with that. So expenses must have been paid for the leave during that time frame of when it started, the April 1st through the end of the year. So keep that in mind. We'll see if things change, if that's further extended going forward. But for now, the FFCRA, so the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, is from April 1st through the end of this year. And eligible employers that pay qualified leave wages will be able to retain an amount of all federal employment taxes equal to the amount of the qualified leave wages. And I know Steve mentioned this as well, but that's on the employer's 941 typically. So documentation, we noted earlier on in the seminar, we noted that there needs to be the documentation on the employee end. So keeping track of, they are certifying, they're acknowledging that they are under doctor's care, for example, they have to self-quarantine. I would recommend that all employers have something of the like in order, and making sure that any employees that are taking any type of leave at this point, that's all documented, and showing, how long they've taken the leave, what's required there, and then obviously copies of completed forms, and then on the completed forms 941 or quarterly federal tax return as well. And then I'll stop there. So just a refresher, we talked about the COVID outbreaks, the necessary leaves when COVID outbreaks come into the workplace, the PPP, what's next, and then finally the tax credit. So we'll open the floor back up to see if there's any additional questions. And then while that happens, here's contact information for both BizHaven as well as Steve, and his LinkedIn profile and direct phone number as well. Definitely want to encourage, if there are any additional questions, or as soon as this application process is available to employers, if there's any situations with questions or stickiness or more than $2 million, as Steve mentioned earlier, that you received, and there is that chance of audit, please feel free to reach out to him with these additional questions. So Darren, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, I just want to once again thank you, Alex and Anna from BizHaven, which all their contact information is there. They're a local Sacramento-based company. We appreciate your participation once again. And Stephen Roth, thank you very much with Roth Consulting, also a consultant with our Small Business Development Center. Encourage you to reach out and ask any additional questions you might have. At this time, again, this recording will be on the city's website at www.cityofsacramento.org/biz-webinars. Also, just for your information, for those that are still with us, in 2 weeks, we'll have Dr. Bielenson from Sacramento County's Health Department will be part of our webinar. And we have him for about an hour to answer your questions related to his health order and anything that you might have concerns of, to make sure that you're following Sacramento County's health orders. So once again, Alex, Anna, and Steve, thank you very much, and we'll sign off.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.